In the lobby of the luxurious Manhattan restaurant, she stood there, her eyes welling up and her voice cracking. "Sir, I just need 5 minutes with Mr. Blake. It's about his son." The hostess laughed. The security guard crossed his arms. And then he appeared, the millionaire himself, surrounded by friends in suits and glasses of champagne. "Is this girl asking you for money?" one of the guests asked. Blake smirked and replied loudly, "She probably wants a picture, or she's selling prayers." She lowered her head. "I just wanted to let you know that I saved your son, but I get it." The laughter echoed, and she left without looking back, while he, blinded by pride, did not know that at that very moment, a truth was about to implode his perfect life. 3 days later, Mr. Blake's phone rang in the middle of the night. It was from the hospital. His 6-year-old son, Henry, had been in a serious accident. Rushing to the emergency room, Blake arrived in a desperate, sweaty state, begging for information. And then he saw for the first time the face of the nurse who had knelt between the cars and given the boy mouth-to-mouth resuscitation before the ambulance arrived. It was her, the poor girl, the same one he had publicly humiliated. The doctor pointed to her and said, "If it hadn't been for that girl, your son wouldn't have made it this far alive." Blake's world spun, and for the first time, he had nothing to say. No excuse, no justification, just the image of her, her hands stained with blood, holding the life he thought money alone could protect. And if this scene already gave you goosebumps, imagine what's yet to come. Like now, subscribe to the channel and hold on to your heart, because the truth he's about to discover will change everything. The lights of New York reflected in the tall windows of the tower where Alexander Blake's office was located. Inside the panoramic elevator, he descended with his cell phone in his hand, his expression cold and his mind too busy to notice the classical music that filled the room. An assistant was talking about million-dollar contracts, but Blake just nodded. His eyes were on the reflection, not out of vanity, but out of control. Everything about him was rigid, precise, inflexible. At the entrance to the restaurant where he would dine with foreign investors, everything was already waiting for him. The young hostess, the maitre d' with impeccable posture, and the crystal glasses perfectly aligned on the dark velvet tables. It was the kind of place where no one raised their voice, where fake smiles cost $1,000, and where poor people didn't get past the door. From the other side of the street, under a half-unlit street lamp, she watched. Camilla was wearing a worn-out coat and clutching a small brown backpack tightly. Her shoes wet from the puddles on the sidewalk, and her trembling hands betrayed more than just the cold. There was urgency in her eyes. She stared inside, trying to see between the customers and employees, searching for him. When she saw him coming, her heart raced. It was now or never. With quick steps and her gaze lowered, she crossed the street, taking a deep breath before climbing the first step. The hostess intercepted her with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. "Are you lost?" she said without smiling. Camilla tried to explain that she just needed a minute with Mr. Blake, that it was about his son. "What?" the woman laughed, looking at a nearby security guard. You know, Mr. Blake, he doesn't have time for this kind of thing." Camilla persisted, trying not to cry, until Blake appeared, coming from the VIP area. Laughter in the background, camera flashes, a glass in his hand, and a distant look in his eyes. When the hostess pointed and said, "This lady says it's important," he raised an eyebrow and walked over to her with disdain. "Camilla, right?" he said, looking as if he were trying to remember where he knew her from. "You were selling something outside my building the other day, weren't you? Or was it at a church?" Camilla shook her head. "It's about Henry," she whispered. But he wasn't listening anymore. One of his friends said something about opportunity hunters, and everyone laughed. Blake, laughing, patted the young woman on the shoulder twice and said, "Thanks for your concern, but my son is fine. How did you manage to get in here anyway?" She then took a deep breath, swallowed her pain, and in a small voice replied, "I pulled him out from under the car when he passed out, but I get it now, good night." She turned and walked down the stairs, her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. The cars continued on, indifferent. Blake's world, luxurious and closed, remained untouched, but that night something had changed. And he didn't know it yet. Camilla grew up where the sidewalks cracked and the windows were covered with plastic in the winter, the daughter of a seamstress who died too soon and a father who disappeared when she was still learning to write her own name. She learned early on that she could not depend on anyone. At 8 years old, she washed dishes for neighbors in exchange for coins. At 12, she was already doing odd jobs in a snack bar, without a contract, without a schedule, without a childhood. Her gaze was never one of someone asking for pity. She looked as if she could handle another day, as if she had no choice. At 16, after losing her only aunt, she slept in shelters for 2 months. She even ate leftovers from hospital trays and picked up clothes from the church's donation drive in Harlem. One day someone asked her how she could still smile. She replied, "Because I'm grateful to still be standing." She didn't say it out of pride, but out of faith. It was this quiet faith that kept her going when everything seemed to want to knock her down. When she turned 18, she got a partial scholarship to take a first aid course at a community institution. She began working as a nursing assistant in nursing homes, caring for elderly people who forgot their own names, but who treated her with more affection than anyone she had ever called family. She slept little and ate even less, but no one ever took away her dignity. It was during one of these night shifts that she met Henry, a little boy hospitalized with a fever and strange symptoms. It was a quick case, they said. His parents were traveling, and a nanny was with him, distracted by her cell phone. Camilla noticed that the boy was shaking. She stayed by his side the entire night. When the nanny fell asleep, she was the one who held him, the one who took his temperature, the one who called the doctors when he had a seizure, the one who wrote everything down and handed it in to the next shift, even though it wasn't her job. A few days later, the hospital fired her for excessive emotional involvement. But the truth was different. Someone complained that a poor nurse shouldn't be in the upper wards. Camilla didn't question it. She packed her things, left a letter thanking her, and left without making a fuss. Except she hadn't forgotten Henry, the fragile boy with frightened eyes and a fear of the dark. She began to look for him discreetly around the private school where he studied, not out of obsession, but out of a strange sense of responsibility that he couldn't explain. When she saw the boy collapse unconscious on the sidewalk one afternoon during a field trip, she ran instinctively. Something was wrong. She knew it. She had seen this kind of collapse before, his eyes rolling back, his breathing short. No one had acted quickly enough, except her, and so she knelt on the asphalt and began to resuscitate him. The paramedics arrived minutes later. Camilla disappeared into the crowd like a ghost, but that image would haunt her and his father for a long time. That same week, while Camilla was walking the streets with a tired soul and her thoughts in turmoil, on the other side of the city, private party was taking place on an exclusive rooftop, frequented by a few millionaires who seemed to live on another planet. Alexander Blake was surrounded by friends, businessmen, influencers, and heirs who talked loudly, laughed at bad jokes, and bet among themselves how many zeros his next business would yield. It was the kind of night when eyes shone with arrogance and not admiration. In the center of the circle, with a glass of expensive whiskey in his hands, Blake joked about poor people's mania for wanting to show off. "Have you noticed that every month someone comes along and says they saved my life or my son's? The other day, a crazy woman stopped me in traffic and said she was praying for him. Man, she looked like a homeless person in a lab coat." The others laughed. "You should turn that into a marketing campaign. Whoever saves Henry gets a picture with his dad." More laughter. That's when one of the friends suggested the joke that changed everything. "I bet you 100,000 that you don't have the guts to call one of those street girls and pretend to thank her in front of everyone, only to ignore her later." Blake, puffed up with pride, didn't hesitate. "Want to see? Tomorrow." The challenge was simple. Find someone who looked like a desperate anonymous person and turn the spotlight on her. It wasn't the first time they had used others as a joke, but it would be the cruelest. And he agreed. They arranged to have dinner at the most luxurious restaurant in the city 2 days later. It was the perfect stage. Camilla was on duty at a public health clinic that day, when she saw a story on the local news about possible food contamination at a private school. Henry's face appeared for 2 seconds in a file image. Her heart raced. She decided to walk past the door of the restaurant where she knew Blake would be, just to warn him. It was a naive attempt, perhaps, but she felt that she couldn't ignore that hunch. She put on her best blouse, tied her hair back, picked up her backpack with her hospital discharge papers, and walked to the address. On the way, she rehearsed 1,000 times what she would say. "Good evening. I'm Camilla. I took care of Henry at the hospital. I think something serious might be happening again." But nothing went as planned. She was stopped, humiliated, pushed away from the place by hands that didn't know what she was carrying. Inside the restaurant, amidst glasses of wine and laughter, Blake, already, knew that this was the perfect girl to stage the bet. The man who had called himself a protective father was now smiling at his own indifference. When she tried to explain, he wouldn't listen. When she mentioned Henry's name, he let out a theatrical sigh. "My son is healthy, thank you." Camilla left there with her face burning with shame. What she didn't know was that some of that laughter was provoked on purpose, that she had been chosen without knowing, that she had been the character of a bet. That should never have happened. But fate silently was already preparing the second act, and no one there was ready for what was to come. 2 days after the humiliation, Camilla could still feel the dry taste of shame in her throat. She was trying to convince herself that she shouldn't have gone, that there was no point in warning her, but something inside her told her that she wasn't done yet. Her heart was restless, as if she knew something was coming. She tried to keep her mind busy by helping a friend with her small children, washing clothes at a 24-hour laundromat, and taking resumes to clinics. But everything seemed silent on the outside and screaming on the inside. That rainy morning she was crossing the street with her hood soaked when she heard a loud noise, a sudden stop and screams. When she looked ahead, her body froze. A boy was on the ground, motionless, his face pale and his eyes half closed. The cars around her were honking. The chaos was immediate. Without thinking, Camilla ran. When she got closer, she recognized him at once. Henry. The same Henry she had taken care of. The same Henry she had tried to protect. People formed a circle, recorded videos, and screamed for help. But no one touched him. Camilla knelt on the wet ground, supported the boy's head with her shirt, and began CPR. She took deep breaths and mentally begged him not to leave her. "Stay with me, little one, stay with me. Remember the giraffe trick that taught you how to breathe." She cried and pressed her chest with firm hands. The minutes seemed like hours. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics carefully pulled her away. One of them asked, "Are you part of the school team?" She shook her head. "I'm just someone who happened to be passing by at the right time." Camilla disappeared into the crowd before anyone could write her name down. She just wanted to know that he would be okay. But just as she turned the corner, she heard one of the rescuers say, "If she hadn't started the massage, the child wouldn't have survived." And that hurt more than it relieved. She knew that Henry's mother wasn't around, and that his father was the same man who had laughed in her face 2 days before. Meanwhile, in Blake's apartment building, the phone rang non-stop. It was from school, then the clinic, then the emergency room. His son was in the hospital, unconscious, and no one knew exactly what had happened before the ambulance arrived. The babysitter had looked away for a few seconds, and then he was on the floor. Blake ran, his face pale and with a lump in his throat that not even money could get rid of. Hours later, at the hospital, he waited in the reception area, his elbows on his knees, his hands covering his eyes. When a doctor appeared in the hallway and said that someone had saved the boy before the ambulance, he stood up immediately. "Who was it? I want to thank you." The doctor leafed through a clipboard and replied, "We don't have a name." But the paramedic said it was a young, skinny brunette with a brown backpack. Blake paled. His heart raced. His mind immediately returned to the restaurant door. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he couldn't control. Guilt. But that wasn't all. The first real contact between them was yet to come, and he wouldn't be the one to cause it. The next day, the hospital was still silent. Henry remained under observation, but stable. Alexander Blake paced the hallway of the Pediatric ward, his suit rumpled, his hair disheveled, his cell phone ignored in his pocket. The business world seemed distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was finding out who had saved his son, and how could he have missed it sooner. When one of the nurses mentioned that a young woman had stopped by looking for information, he ordered them to find her. But she was already gone. No name, no number, just a fuzzy image captured on the security cameras. Hours later, a benefit for hospitalized. Children was being held at the reception. Blake was invited to speak. As he stepped onto the small makeshift stage, with the flashbulbs of business magazine photographers and gossip columnists trained on his face, he tried to sound composed, but as soon as he mentioned his son's name, his voice broke. He took a deep breath and continued. Today I should be talking about investments in health, about supporting science, but I'm here because someone, who has nothing, did everything for my son. Young woman who disappeared as if she were invisible, and who perhaps only got closer because one day I ignored her. The audience was silent. He didn't say any names, but the weight was there. At that very moment, Camilla was watching the broadcast of the event on a small television in the waiting room. She was there to visit a friend who was hospitalized in another ward. But when she heard the name of the hospital on the loudspeaker, she felt something inexplicable and went upstairs. She stopped far away, leaning against a pillar, almost hidden. When the event ended, Blake was escorted out by security, but he looked around uneasily. And that was when their eyes met. She was standing in the hallway, backpack on her shoulders, her eyes still calm as always. He froze. His approach was slow, as if time had slowed down. The reporters tried to follow him, but they were held back. Blake walked towards her. The two stared at each other for several long seconds. "You," he began, but his voice trailed off. "It was you, wasn't it?" She didn't answer. She just stared at him, expressionless. Then he did something no one expected. He knelt down, in the middle of the white hallway, in front of the cameras still recording in the distance. "Forgive me. I didn't know. I laughed at you when all you wanted was to help." The scene went around the country in minutes. Headlines featured photos of the millionaire on his knees in front of a stranger. But what most people didn't see was what Camilla said next. Without raising her voice, she replied, "I didn't want your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know how special Henry is." And then she turned her back and walked away. In that instant, the laughter that had once echoed about her fell silent. The humiliation had been returned, not with shouts but with dignity. Camilla walked through the hospital corridors without looking back. She didn't need to. She had already said everything. The words that weren't shouted, but that bled. Inside had been spoken with the firmness of someone who knows the weight of silence. She left through the side door, crossed the parking lot, and walked down streets that seemed emptier than ever. But at the same time, he felt strangely light. Not because everything was resolved, but because she no longer carried the burden alone. He knew, and that was enough. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, Alexander Blake sat motionless, his hands in his lap, his head down, feeling an emptiness he didn't recognize. His son, sleeping in recovery, was now the only thing that made sense. No meetings, no contracts, no applause, just that small body in the bed and the memory of a woman he had once scorned with sarcasm and who now made him feel small. Hours later, at home, Blake searched through folders, cameras, and records. He needed to know more about her. He discovered her full name, Camilla Ortega. He found old records of the hospital nanny who had mentioned someone named Camilla, who was too intrusive. He vaguely remembered seeing her in a hallway months ago, looking at her as if she didn't matter. But now it all made sense. The excessive care, the affection, the watchful eyes. Camilla wasn't a stranger. She was the one who held his son in the early hours of the morning when he was away on trips and dinners. She was the one who read stories and turned out the lights. She was the one who stayed even after she was unfairly dismissed. The next day, he returned to the hospital. He asked the administration if she was still registered as a visitor, as a former employee. Nothing. He left his contact information with the receptionist, begging to be notified if she returned. But she never did. Throughout the week, he discreetly put up thank you posters and posted ads online asking for help in finding the hero nurse, but without mentioning her name. It was the least he could do, but silence was the only response. Camilla watched everything from afar. She knew he was trying. She received screenshots from her friends, saw the video of him kneeling go viral, listened to the messages left on her prepaid cell phone, which she didn't answer. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she needed to breathe. She needed to understand if all of this changed who he was or just what he felt. She knew about the bet, not at the moment she was humiliated, but hours later. A waitress, touched by the situation, caught up with her as she was leaving the restaurant. She told her, through tears, that she had heard everything, that night had been set up. Camilla listened, thanked her and smiled weakly. The pain was already there. Knowing the truth only confirmed that the world Blake lived in was crueler than she had imagined. Now, with him seeking redemption, Camilla had to decide whether the truth she knew would serve as a bridge or a wall. But most of all, she knew she had a story that no one could ever take away from her. She had saved Henry. And he, even without knowing it, had saved the little faith she still had left. In the darkened office, with its windows looking out onto the skyscrapers of Manhattan, Alexander Blake watched the images of the hospital on a loop. The same scene, her with her backpack on her shoulders, walking down the hallway slowly, without fear, without bending. Her dignity was what hurt the most. Not the fact that he had been ignored, nor the public humiliation that followed, but the realization that while he had been using people as pawns, she had been saving lives in silence. For the first time, she felt ashamed not of what she had done, but of who she had become. Then, amidst so many records, a name appeared on his computer screen, St. Mary's Foundation for Children's Rehabilitation. A simple name, no updated website, no marketing, just a small record of donations made in the name of Camilla Ortega, intended for the treatment of children with cerebral palsy. Curious, he called. A woman answered and said in a tired voice, "Camilla? Oh yes, she comes here on Saturdays. She never accepts coffee, but she always brings toys." Blake hung up slowly. It hit him like a punch. While he was spending ridiculous amounts of money on parties and stupid bets, she was giving away the spare change she could to children the system had forgotten about. He started looking for more. He found her name linked to a shelter in the Bronx. Another nurse mentioned that she volunteered on cold nights. And then came the revelation that knocked him out for good. A letter tucked away in a drawer at the hospital. An old handwritten note dated months ago. "Mr. Blake, I know you'll never read this, but please take care of Henry. He's more sensitive than he looks. Sometimes he cries in the bath. Sometimes he talks in his sleep, calling for his mommy. I've held him in the middle of the night, but he needs more than that. He needs presence. I'm sorry for caring too much. Camilla." His hands were shaking as he finished reading. That girl to whom he had reduced the joke was the only one who saw his son as a child and not as an heir. The only one who had seen what he, in his emotional blindness, had never wanted to see. Henry needed love, presence, someone like her. That same night, Blake called the nanny for a chat. For the first time, he listened in silence. She confessed, Camilla was the one who really took care of Henry during the most difficult times. She was the one who taught him to eat by himself, to overcome nightmares. She was the one who slept sitting on the floor when the boy had a fever. And what's more, she never asked for anything in return. She never demanded recognition. She just did it. Blake walked back into his son's room and watched him sleep. His breathing was shallow, his small hand clenched into a fist. He sat down beside his bed and for the first time in a long time cried. Not because of the cameras, not because of his wounded pride, but because he was finally seeing everything he had ignored for so long. And in that moment I knew I needed to find her, not to clear her name, but to truly apologize. The next day, Henry's room was silent. The flowers Camilla had anonymously left were already wilting in a plastic cup on the table next to his bed. Blake ran his fingers over the dried petals and felt something he couldn't name. Absence. A deep sense that someone had left, taking with them the purest part of that place. For days he walked the streets, clinics, shelters. He called every foundation where her name had appeared. He handwrote notes apologizing, handed them to volunteers who had never seen her. But Camilla had disappeared like a strong wind that blows and then falls silent. She had left no trace. She had moved to another neighborhood. She had changed her number. She had erased her digital traces, not out of anger, but out of instinct. She needed to start over in silence. She needed to exist without the weight of his name, without the headlines, without the apology messages, expensive flowers, or attempts at redemption. She was tired of being someone else's story. She wanted to go back to being just Camilla. In a small town 2 hours away, she got a job at a popular clinic. She started over, without titles, without diplomas that she never had, only with what she carried in her heart, vocation. The children became attached to her within days. The elderly called her name as if she were part of the family, and even with little, she smiled as if she knew she was in the right place. But every night when she went to bed, she thought of Henry, of his pale face, of the small hand holding hers while he coughed, and of her father, standing, without understanding anything, in the middle of the white corridor of the hospital. Meanwhile, Blake tried to fill the void that her absence had left, but it wasn't a romantic absence. It was an absence of essence. It was as if he had discovered the taste of humility, of surrender, and then lost it all in seconds. Even surrounded by advisors, he began to do things he never imagined: take his son to school, sit with him to draw, listen to his fears. He tried to transform himself, but deep down, he knew he wasn't complete. One day he took Henry to a benefit organized by St. Mary's Foundation. It was a cloudy afternoon. Children ran between tents with books, games, and face painting. Henry walked curiously toward an area with puppets. Then he stopped, standing there, his eyes fixed on the puppets. He whispered, "Daddy, it's her." Blake turned his head, his heart racing. But when he looked, there was only a silhouette with his back to the girl, helping a girl adjust a bow in her hair. He approached slowly, his breath catching in his chest. But when the woman turned around, it wasn't Camilla. Henry, disappointed, said quietly, "I thought you were—" Blake smiled sadly. "I thought so too." It was as if the world was telling him she was gone, that now he was the one who had to carry the silence. On the way home, Henry fell asleep in the back seat, and Blake at the wheel knew for sure the poor girl he had scorned was the richest woman he had ever met, and she left without asking for anything, not even a thank you. In Alexander Blake's world, everything was always built on image. His company's stocks rose with well-spoken interviews, speeches at global forums, and calibrated smiles. But the truth is that since Camilla's disappearance, that facade began to crack from the inside out. He longer spoke with the same firmness. He would get dates wrong in meetings, mix up names in interviews, and most seriously, he would turn down invitations to social events, turn down million-dollar deals, refuse to be the man he was. The media began to take notice. First, there were small rumors: Mr. Blake in crisis after controversy with unidentified employee. Then, more direct headlines. Who is the woman who made the tycoon kneel in public? He tried to silence the rumors, but all it took was a leaked behind-the-scenes video for everything to come crashing down. It was an internal recording, captured by a hidden cell phone on the night of the bet. Blake's voice was clear. "I'll show you how to silence a desperate woman." The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the dirty smiles. The video ended up on social media. Within hours, it was on every portal. The fall was brutal. Investors demanded explanations. NGOs cut ties. Parents of students at Henry's school called for his removal. From the management committee, hashtags took over the internet. Where is Camilla? Justice for Camilla. Excuses aren't enough. His name became synonymous with arrogance. The greatest pain, however, was not in the cancelled contracts. It was in the look on his son's face. Henry, sitting on the couch, watched the video with his father without wanting to. He was silent for minutes. Then he asked, "Did you laugh at her, Daddy?" Blake tried to explain, tried to distort, tried to justify. But Henry just shook his head. She sang to me when I cried. Did you know that? That was the breaking point. The moment Blake realized he had lost more than credibility. He had broken something in his own son's heart. Something no fortune could mend. Days later, an in-depth story aired on national television. Press investigators located Camilla. Out of respect, they did not reveal her address, but they did reveal parts of her story, her difficult childhood, her volunteer shifts, her heroic gesture. The story had no vengeful tones. It was just the truth, raw, human. And with that, the public judgment took on a new form. No longer just against him, but against the system that allowed people like Camilla to be invisible while men like Blake were applauded. His image began to appear on posters in silent protests, and the question echoed on the posters. How many more Camillas will be humiliated before someone sees? Inside his home, surrounded by luxury and solitude, Blake turned off his phone, the TV, and his emails. He sat down in his armchair and closed his eyes. The palms that had once made him so proud were gone, and in their place was only the echo of the burning question. How could someone who had everything fail to see what mattered most? Alexander Blake began to walk alone, without aids, without security, without haste, along sidewalks he had previously despised, along streets he would never have entered months ago. He traded the armored car for the subway, the tailored suit for an old jacket. It was not theater. It was not an attempt to clean up his image. It was loss, it was pain. And it was, above all, an attempt to understand what was inside him, now that everything outside had collapsed. Over the next few weeks, he began to frequent community centers, small churches, places where names didn't matter. No one recognized him, and when they did, they looked down in disapproval. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to convince anyone. He just listened. He washed dishes. In silence at a shelter. He served soup in soup kitchens. He tended the garden at a nursing home. The money was still there, but he no longer used it as a shield. At home, the silence was different. Henry had changed. He talked less. He drew more. Camilla appeared on the sheets of paper in childlike lines, a dark-haired woman holding the hand of a small boy beside a tree. She made me count the stars when I was scared, he said one night. Blake felt his throat close up. She said it was God's way of showing us that we were never alone. It was that night that he decided he needed to really change, not for Henry, not for Camilla, but for himself. He began a process of silent transformation. He created a foundation in her name, but he didn't call it Camilla Ortega Foundation. He called it Presence, because that's what she had been in his son's life. A presence. And he decided that he wouldn't use her image in campaigns, nor his own. No emotional speeches, no media, just actions. He began to quietly fund scholarships for homeless girls, clinics in forgotten neighborhoods, school reinforcement programs. In one of the foundation's rooms, he hung a single photo, a photo taken by chance in the hospital, Camilla from behind, holding Henry's hand in an empty hallway, the light flooding in through the window. An image without pose, without makeup, without artifice. It was the only visible tribute, the most sincere. Months passed, and while the world slowly forgot the scandal, Blake grew inside. With each gesture without an audience, with each silent apology, to himself, to his memory, to the lost time, he grew closer to the version of the man he never imagined he could be. But her absence continued to hurt, not as a longing for love, but as a longing for justice, for balance, for looking into her eyes without guilt and saying, "Now I understand." His old world had crumbled, but from that ground, something began to grow that no amount of money could buy. Consciousness. The meeting did not take place at an event, nor under the spotlights. There was no audience, nor hidden photographers. It took place in a narrow hospital corridor on the pediatric floor, where footsteps echo softer and looks speak louder than voices. Camilla was leaving a room, her hair tied up in a casual way and a stethoscope hanging around her neck. She had worked as a volunteer for months in that small hospital unit in the countryside. She had been called to an emergency shift, as there was. A shortage of professionals on a rainy Friday morning. As she calmly filled out reports, she heard a familiar, childish voice. "Camilla?" She turned slowly. Henry was standing a few feet away, holding a little book with dinosaurs on it and a colorful bandage on his arm. Time seemed to stand still in his eyes. There was still sweetness. There was still recognition. Behind him, Alexander Blake. Thinner, simpler, his eyes swollen from sleepless nights, and his chest carrying the weight of everything. That was left unsaid. He hadn't expected to see her there. He had taken his son for a checkup, not to meet her. But there they were, face to face, as if fate had waited for the right time. Camilla took a deep breath. Henry ran to her and hugged her without asking for permission. "Do you still remember the Song of the Stars?" She smiled and nodded, her heart racing. "Of course I do." Blake approached slowly. When he stopped in front of her, the silence was long and honest. He didn't try to justify himself or look for pretty words. He just spoke as if he no longer expected forgiveness but needed to say it. "I wronged you. I laughed at your pain. I ignored your voice. And yet, you saved what was most precious to me." She stared at him steadily. There was no anger in her eyes, only the dignity of someone who did not need revenge to win. "You didn't owe me anything, Mr. Blake. What I did for Henry wasn't for you. And what you did, well, that doesn't hurt me anymore. Because I know who I am." The words fell like balm and steel. There was no hurt, but there was no bond either. Camilla didn't smile or cry. She just stood her ground. Henry tugged on her hand. "Daddy talked about you every day. He's changed." She looked at the boy. "Then take care of him. Don't let the world teach him what you had to unlearn." Blake just nodded. He knew this wasn't a moment to win back. It was about acknowledging, accepting. Camilla then bent down, kissed Henry on the forehead, squeezed his hand affectionately and stood up. She looked one last time at the man in front of her, not as the millionaire who humiliated her, but as the father of a child she loved sincerely. And then, without saying goodbye, he turned and walked down the hall. Camilla didn't have to think much. She had already made her decision long before that reunion. When she saw Blake kneeling in the hospital, when she heard the apology that didn't come from his mouth, but from his eyes, and especially when she realized that Henry was truly smiling, that's when she knew what she needed to do. It wasn't about going back or staying. It was about freeing herself, him, and the past that weighed between them like thick, cracked glass, ready to shatter. The next morning, Blake showed up at the hospital again with a simple bouquet of wildflowers and an envelope in his hands. He waited for her outside, sitting on a bench under a tree whose leaves swayed as if listening to everything. When she came out the side door, she saw him standing there alone with the same look on his face as the day before. He stood up slowly and held out the envelope. "It's not money. It's foundation papers. I put it in your name. You can accept it or refuse it. But I had to do it. It was the least I could do." Camilla didn't extend her hand. She just watched him silently. He then put the envelope down and continued. "I don't want you to forgive me out of pity, nor do I want you to come back out of obligation. I just needed to show you that I understood, that I've changed, that I am today someone capable of truly listening to you." She took a deep breath. She looked up at the sky, then at him, and in a low, firm voice she answered, "You don't need me to come back to keep changing. You need to keep going even without an audience, even without applause, because deep down, that's what you never had. Silence. I come from silence, and it was in silence that I learned to be strong." He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing every word. When he opened them, she was already reaching out, not to take the envelope, but to briefly touch his shoulder. A small gesture, but full of meaning. "You hurt me, but you also revealed me. Because sometimes pain reminds us of who we are. Thank you for coming here, but I choose to move on." She took a step back. He didn't insist. He just nodded with a lump in his throat and teary eyes. Camilla then walked to the sidewalk and disappeared into the movement of the street, mixed in with the sounds of the city that continued to be alive, indifferent and eternal. Blake remained on the bench for a few minutes. Then he left the envelope nearby, under the shade of the tree, and he walked away in silence, not with the weight of defeat, but with the lightness of someone who had finally understood the value of losing someone on merit. Camilla didn't look back, because she had already said what she needed to, and her absence was now a choice. Not escape, not anger, but freedom. A month later, it was late afternoon in a nearly empty park. The orange autumn leaves slid across the benches, and the wind blew slowly, as if it wanted to prolong the moment. Henry was running across the lawn with a paper airplane in his hands. He laughed out loud, stumbled, and got up. Alexander Blake, sitting alone on a wooden bench, watched in silence, his eyes calm and his hands clasped on his knees. Beside him, a small, open backpack, lay a child's notebook. Inside, a notebook with children's drawings, a bitten apple, and a carefully folded piece of paper. He took it slowly and opened it. It was one of Henry's drawings, 3 figures holding hands, the boy in the center, smiling. On the left, a dark-haired man. On the right, a woman with the same eyes as Camilla. No name, no title, just color, just presence. Blake ran his fingers gently over the paper. Then, without saying anything, he folded it again, put it back, and stood up. He walked slowly over to where Henry was, bent down and held out his arms. The boy ran over and threw himself into the embrace. In the background, the camera would pull back, framing the two of them in the golden light of the setting sun, while in the distance, behind a tree, someone discreetly left a white flower on the empty bench where Blake had been sitting, and she left, without being seen. If this story touched your heart, take a deep breath now, and write here in the comments, "I also believe in the power of silence." This shows that you stuck with us until the end, and your presence here matters a lot. Leave a like if you felt something different with this story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take advantage now. We tell stories like this every week, real, human, and with endings that speak louder than 1,000 words. And if you want to continue on this journey of true emotions, click on the video that is appearing on the screen now. The next story will leave you with goosebumps, and perhaps tears in your eyes again. I'll meet you there.